Hi folks, it's Blake back at you. This WordsDB71 is my username up there or down here somewhere. I wanted to get back and finally do a video that's music related. I'm sure some of you guys are tired of seeing all this sleeve talk. Um, so, in my introduction, it was became pretty well known that Blake is the classical guy, and I have to downplay this quite a bit because I wasn't raised in any kind of music family, nor am I trained in any way. My knowledge, what little there is that I have about classical music was something that I just got into as an interest, maybe uh, probably 10, 11 years ago. So what I've learned is just purely what I was hearing on the radio and some books that I read and some of the music that I've been listening to myself. So I'm by no means an expert, but I do think I have enough knowledge to help some of the others out there in the vinyl community that has expressed interest in learning more. I've gotten a very warm welcome and quite a few questions about just classical music and classical music on vinyl in general. So what I'd like to do is try to start answering some of these questions while hopefully soon I'll get to start showing some of my own records. But for this first video, I'm going to call this Classical Music for the Vinyl Community 101, if I can get that in the title. And what I want to do here is just try to um, throw out a picture of classical music in terms of its historical um, evolution. Like when if someone asks you about rock music, clearly most of you can lay out many decades of styles and changes that have happened with music that we term rock music. And the same thing can be said for classical music. There are some very big groupings, historical periods, and within each one of those, there are minor periods that can be um, teased out if you want to get very academic about it. So this first video, Classical Music for the Vinyl Community 101, I just want to walk through some of those big periods and try to get you familiar with some of the names that you'll find in those periods. And then on succeeding videos, we'll just keep building up on that, and then at least you'll have some kind of basis for where some of these composers, where they fit into the overall time frame. Now, I have to be honest, as you will find with most lovers of classical music, they have an area that they tend to favor, and I favor the Romantic period, and we'll get to that. But let's start with I don't know, I guess jump right into it. And all of the stuff about classical music really is focusing on the what we call music in the Western world, the classical music of the Western world. There are lots of other music um, sources, I guess you'd say, that have evolved very differently from the Western notion of classical music. So getting right into it, right up through and until the Middle Ages, most music was monophonic, meaning just one voice, and basically the focus was just on a rhythm or a melody and some words around that. It was very simple in terms of um, what we think of as music today. But up until around the ninth century, the idea of polyphonic music started forming, where we have more than one voice floating on a melody, and those melodies kind of interweaving within the work itself. Um, Again, to modern ears, that it will sound very archaic, and this evolution from monophonic to polyphonic to what we will term classical music was a very slow evolution, um, and it wasn't until about the 14th century uh, that we started getting closer and closer to what we think of as classical music, where we start introducing more instrumentation and an idea around uh, not just a single melody driving a whole piece of music. So we get from the Middle Ages up to the Renaissance, which in musical terms, at least in some of the literature I've like briefed just to make this video, they group around the 1430s to the 1600s, and they call that the Renaissance period of classical music. And we start getting into more involvement in instruments, like I said, into a melody, and names that will pop up more often in the music that you see that's been recorded will be names like Machaut, Dufay, Delasso, and Palestrina. Um, Palestrina probably will be the most recognizable name that you'll see in records in the crate digs that you get into. Um, it really is the Baroque period, 1600 to about 1750, a 150-year range there. You really start getting into uh, the classical music that we're more familiar with. Here we have an evolution to more of a homophonic type of music where you have a single melody line kind of working through a piece of music, and then you have instruments and other voices um, supporting that melody with um, harmonic components or the harmonies that are built around the melody. Um, let's see names for this that you'll recognize in this period would be Monteverdi, Purcell, Rameau, um, probably the early Baroque, and then you get into middle and later Baroque with rock stars, as I would call it. A favorite of mine, Vivaldi. Then Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. Scarlatti is another name, and Handel um, is another big name that you'll see in these periods. Uh, One thing about this period, Baroque period, this is where opera was really started, and the concerto grossi form was a big um, form that came from this period. Uh, we go from Baroque to the Classical period, 1750 to 1825, and this is known to other historians as the Age of Reason. And this is where most of the most significant forms of classical music evolved, where we have symphonies, sonatas, concerto form, string quartets, things like that. And not as wide a range in terms of years, but again significant, and names that you will recognize from this period: Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, all from the classical period. Um, One of the things about this music, and we'll come back to this when we go to the Romantic period next. A lot of this music can be classified as like inspirational or uplifting music to edify. The Romantic period 1825 to 1900, as I said before, was some of my favorite music was coming from. And this is a much more mature music. Through the ages, we're figuring out what we can do with music. But by this point, during the Romantic period, we've had revolutions, we've had wars, the Industrial Revolution is happening, and with all that, a lot of the music composers of music started pushing the boundaries of what music can do, and instead of being just inspiring and uplifting like the classical period, these guys here were more interested in really getting into the human condition with music. They wanted to melt your heart. They wanted to overwhelm you, reduce you to tears with their music, maybe astound you or astonish you with their ability. Um, and if your hairs got raised on end, well, that was a victory for them. It could be said that this period of music was a revolution in expressiveness, and names from this period, uh, lots of names, and I'll just read through a bunch of them that I've got noted down here. Rossini, Carl Marie von Weber, um, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Berlioz, Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Wagner, Verdi, Brahms, my favorite, Dvorak, uh, Mussorgsky, Tchaikovsky, Strauss, Mahler, Bizet, Grieg, and Rimsky-Korsakov are names that I've got down here. Then after the Romantic period, we go into 20th century music, which I am honestly not that familiar with because I've been stuck in the Romantic period. I have to throw this out to Teddy, Vinyliciousness, and others to pick up with more detail on the 20th century and more modern stuff where we get into a lot of Impressionism, Expressionism, neoclassicism, experimentation, serialism, minimalism, electronic music, and very, to a certain extent, some very academic styles of music, just to see what can be done uh, with the musical form. And the names here, again, quite a few types of names, and I've got them written down, and I'll go through some of these. Debussy, Sibelius, Ravel, Ives, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Bartók, Berg, Hindemith, Hindemith, Prokofiev, Aaron Copland, Dmitri Shostakovich, Fauré, Janacek, Nielsen, Rachmaninoff, Ralph Vaughan Williams, George Gershwin, is a very good one, Ellington, Cage, yeah, Ellington, Duke Ellington. So here's some of our tie to jazz music now with Gershwin and Ellington. Um, Stockhausen, Ligeti, Riley. Now we're getting into much more modern music with Stockhausen, Ligeti, Riley, uh, Glass, and Reich. Um, so that's a very quick rundown of some of the historical periods of classical music. Now, in successive videos, what I'll do is try to focus in on some music that I'm enjoying, and again, you'll probably get more stuff from the Romantic period from me initially, but I'll try to give a good balance of it later on. Now, what to do about getting into music. There are lots of books, of course. I want to point out two that are very accessible and easy to get into. Like a lot of the notes that I just went through, I pulled from this book, Classical Music, The Vintage Guide to Classical Music. Jan Swafford is the author there. Um, Still in print, a very good book. It's about 600 pages, but it's very quick to read. Actually, the font is pretty big. They probably cheated there. And another book is an encyclopedia kind of book, the NPR Listener's Encyclopedia to Classical Music. Um, this is one of those types of books where you can just pick up wherever you want to go with composers, some performers, some musical terms and things like that. In fact, I've got Dvorak. keyed here. Very, very easy to get to in and out of. I would just recommend having a copy of this lying around so whenever you see something, you can just easily grab it. This is Ted Libby. Yeah, Ted Libby is the author there. And again, the NPR listeners, Encyclopedia of Classical Music. This is certainly still in print. I know this one isn't that old. In fact, it's a newer edition, I think. Um, so that's it for right now, and I'll be back hopefully soon with a part two, I guess, a 102 class, and then we'll get into some real music. So if you have any questions, send them on, and give me some comments if you want me to focus on something specific. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye bye.